The rain started before noon, a soft insistence on the windows that swelled into a steady percussion by 5. It made the city feel suspended, as if the towers had lifted their hems and were tiptoeing over puddles. My coffee went cold twice. I kept forgetting it was there. The screen's glow made the papers around my keyboard look like theater props. The only real thing was the slow ache in my neck and the bone-deep hum of the HVAC that always arrived just after the elevator's last departure for the evening. Somewhere on another floor, someone played jazz low enough to be a rumor. I imagined a horn player leaning against a column, playing to the hallway's echo, and thought, if I close this last ticket, I can go home to a quiet apartment where a lamp will be the warmest thing waiting. On nights like that, the city's lights seemed older than people. They had a patience I didn't inherit. I had spent a decade making sure that deadlines lined up the way train cars should, with a hand on the safety chain and the other on the schedule. When my marriage ended 3 years ago, quietly with more apologies than anger, I found that what I missed most wasn't companionship. It was the small gravity of sharing a space with someone who knew when to set an extra cup on the counter. At work, I could be gravity for everyone else. At home, I didn't know how to be it for myself. By 6:30, the office thinned. The sales team had already drifted out in pairs, perfumed and unhurried. The designers left trails of sketches like fallen leaves. HR said goodnight loudly, as if volume could win against the storm. I stayed. I was known for staying, and for carrying extra copies of the deck and a spare charger in my bag. I wore professionalism like armor and found, over the years, that I could breathe inside it. The news came by the ping of an email and the way my boss's assistant materialized beside my desk. The subject line had the company's name, followed by the kind of word that makes a stomach tilt. Audit. Under that, a shorter word. Leak. We had an investor call in 2 weeks and a product rollout queued up neatly behind it, and suddenly all of it felt like a stack of plates one bad gust could send to the floor. Hold for Leo, the assistant said, meaning our CEO. She did not sit, which meant Leo would not be long. And his guest. The guest had been rumor for a week. A former consultant turned investor, the kind who made boardrooms listen harder by talking softer. My boss's best friend from graduate school. Reappearing when you could argue we needed him most or least, depending on your faith in coincidence. His name had threaded through conversations like a cautionary melody. Some people already disliked him for it. The elevator sighed open at the far end of the atrium. Leo came first, tall, suit rumpled the way a handsome man's gets rumpled on purpose. Apology already in his eyes because he always seemed to like me more than the job required. Beside him was the man from rumor. He didn't need introduction, but Leo gave it to me anyway, with a hand lifted like an offering. I stood, the rain making faint shadows on the carpet that kept time with my pulse. This is Daniel, my boss said, and the way his voice warmed on the name told a history I didn't know. He's agreed to help us look at the leak issue. Think of him as an extra set of eyes, not a god. We already have one of those in this office. I nodded, appreciating the joke more than it deserved. Daniel smiled with the kind of restraint that meant amusement, not politeness. He had the kind of face that reads quiet until it smiles, and then the room brightened by a watt or two. Close-cropped hair gone silver at the temples, a mouth with the muscle memory of kindness, a gaze that took in a lot without feeling invasive. He shook my hand with a brief, steady pressure. I registered the warmth of his palm, the dry sleeves, the faint scent of clean wool and rain. I've read your name in too many emails, he said, and his voice had a low instrument in it, like a cello playing through a wall. It's good to finally put a person to the efficiency. He said it without flirtation, and yet there was something there, the way an overcast sky still remembers it was once blue. We sat at a table made for 15 and opened laptops, and the rehearsal of work began. In the hours that followed, I learned the shorthand of how he thought. He didn't ask trick questions. He asked clarifying ones. He found contradictions gently, the way you might pick glass from a friend's hair. We traced permission levels and VPN logs, lined up the sequence of drafts with the timing of download requests. The leak was not a rupture. It was a puncture wound. Something small and precise was letting air out we couldn't afford to lose. Between screens and notes, I learned other things. He'd moved back to the city a year ago to be closer to his brother, who had started to forget names. He'd taken more early flights than he could remember and was trying to be home for dinner at least 3 nights a week now, though home was a set of rooms he was still getting used to. He had been married once and didn't sound like he held it against himself that it ended. He was the kind of man who didn't claim asceticism, he claimed adjustment. I did not tell him that I still woke sometimes to the phantom sound of keys in a lock that no longer turned. I didn't tell him that when I saw couples in polite restaurants, I admired the choreography more than the romance. I told him about the leak, and about the interns, and how our design lead refused to name files with dates because time is a construct. He laughed softly at that, and I was astonished by how much I wanted to make him laugh again. We were still tracing the needle when the building's steam heat clicked loudly. Our office manager had left hours earlier. The storm had deepened into a steady pour that erased the city's edges. Leo had tried to stay, and then had been called away by something he labeled urgent with that apologetic look, his hand to Daniel's shoulder in a gesture I recognized from long friendships. We said we'd lock up behind us. We returned to our screens, to the glass walls that made us ghostly in reflection. It was a little after 10 when I stood to refill my water, and the lights in the corridor dimmed to their sleepy low. I swiped my badge to the kitchenette, and a small chime replied wrong. I tried again. Wrong again. Daniel looked up from the conference table and saw my mouth form a small, impolite word. Bad timing, he said, rising. He swiped his badge. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The storm had been loud enough to make the building jump a fuse, and the building had decided that all those who remained were no longer allowed to be where they were. We tried the exit at the other end of the floor. We tried the stairwell door and laughed at our assumption that stairs are always available, as if fire codes were friends. We were locked into our glass square with a rain-washed city for company and a working heater as consolation prize. Could be worse, he said, checking his phone and finding no signal that reached past the building's sudden suspicion. We could like each other less. The confession was dressed as humor, but it settled in the room with a weight that did not want to be laughed away. I felt an involuntary shift inside me, the kind you feel when you ease a window open to hear the rain better. We texted the numbers we could. We sent notes into the void. We stood at opposite sides of the conference table and looked at each other, and then looked away, like colleagues in a painting who know they are being watched. I found a blanket left from a wellness initiative and surrendered it to his shoulders. He took it, then draped half back over mine with a care that felt older than attraction. The rain insisted on the windows. The night loosened us. Work talk became weather talk became story talk. He said he once got snowed into a rural airport overnight and made friends with a vending machine that only dispensed pretzels, never chips. I said I spent a hurricane at my parents' house and learned the sound of my mother praying was like the kettle when it's almost ready. He told me he still ran in the mornings, slower now and more for gratitude than time. I told him I used to paint and then forgot to, as if forgetting was a virtue. He asked, gently, what I was protecting by staying so late at work so often. I told him, after a breath, that repetition looks like control until it looks like avoidance, and I hadn't decided which I preferred. He nodded as if I'd said something normal. He had a way of making my guard feel redundant. Eventually, we returned to the problem that had made us share air in the first place. Without network access, we were back to analog. We pinned timelines with sticky notes and drew lines the color of highlighter that made constellations across the table. He leaned over a cluster of printouts and his sleeve brushed my wrist, and that small contact felt more significant than any love scene I'd ever watched on a screen. I had thought closeness was about quantity. It turned out to be about accuracy. We found our way, as the night stitched itself into something intimate and quiet, to one alarming pattern. A junior account executive, chatty and competent, had access to a folder she didn't need. Not just one access. A series of them, always late, always after messages to a contact outside the company, the metadata whispering a narrative we did not want to believe. She was not malicious. She was the sort of person the office adored, which made it worse. I could feel the future press against the glass, full of HR meetings and forms, and the sad theatricality of escorting someone gently out the door. People make difficult choices in small increments, Daniel said softly, as if I had accused her personally. They don't plan the fall, they plan the step. I thought of every small compromise I'd made in the name of calm. Not asking for what I wanted because I didn't want to burden anyone with the reality that I wanted. I thought of the emails I wrote with the courage drained out of them, and how that too can be a leak. The office was very still. The city had the particular glow it gets when the rain stops and the streets pretend they can reflect the moon. He looked at me. It wasn't a stare. It was an invitation to acknowledge what hung between us like electricity still stored in the air long after the lightning. He said my name, and something inside me softened into relief. I thought of my former husband, kind in all the ways that last too late, and of how we had learned to be polite so completely we starved. I thought of how my pulse now was not an alarm, it was a yes. We did not kiss. We did not negotiate aloud. We sat closer without announcing it and shared warmth like co-conspirators in a small benevolence. His hand found the edge of the blanket at my shoulder and steadied it there. The night around us thinned into a single breath-held moment that felt less like some grand arrival and more like the room finally tuning to the right frequency. There's a kind of intimacy that is merely proximity. This was the other kind, the kind that feels like being allowed, finally, to speak in your own language. And then morning began to think about existing. We must have drifted for an hour. I woke to a dim square of gray in the east and the soft complaint of the building coming alive again. My badge worked the second try. He stood to stretch and winced in a way that confessed to age and a stubborn neck. He made a joke about his runner's spine, and I laughed because I liked that he let me see the graceless parts. I folded the blanket, mindful now of the lint, and pointed at the sticky note pattern that waited, patient and undeniable. By 10 o'clock, the office had filled with the scent of espresso and the kind of gossip that feeds on uncertainty. I took our findings to Leo. He read quickly, then slowly, then looked at the window not because he needed to, but because he wanted my face to move somewhere it wouldn't show more than I intended. He asked how confident I was. I said, quietly, very. He nodded. He said he hated this part. It sounded true. In a small room with a view of another building's small rooms, we spoke with the junior account executive. I watched her understand something irrevocable before it finished being said. I watched her be angry at herself and at a world that had offered pressures without offering scripts. She didn't cry. She apologized to the wrong people, and then to the right ones. HR made notes like surgeons. We collected her key card. She left with a box that looked indecently theatrical, and the eyes of the office on her back like a weather pattern. The rumor mill spun faster than the shredder. That afternoon there was a meeting in which the board expressed disappointment in the abstract and appreciation in the specific. Daniel stood at my shoulder with a presence that was neutral enough to be professional and steady enough to be personal. He did not speak for me and did not make me speak sooner than I would have. He folded his arms in a way that didn't dismiss anyone, and when he talked about next steps, he said, "We like it had always included me." When the meeting ended, Leo asked him to stay behind, the door closing with a soft intended finality. I gathered my notes and walked to my desk on legs that felt newer than the rest of me, as if someone had upgraded them without asking. Emails congratulated me for the catch, as if it were a fish I'd landed and not a person I'd watched falter. I wrote replies that were polite and spare. The rain had stopped completely. The sky looked scrubbed. By 5, I wanted only 2 things: a shower so hot it bordered on prayer and something uncomplicated to eat. Instead, I found Daniel waiting by the elevator bank, hands in his pockets, eyes set softly on the middle distance like a man trying not to scare a skittish animal. He asked, without words, if I was ready to be noticed walking to the door with him. There is a small risk in everything. I nodded. We did not talk on the sidewalk. The city had that after-rain smell that feels like a promise if you're generous and like a trick if you aren't. Cars hissed. People resumed their normal choreography with renewed arrogance, as if destiny had put on sneakers. At the corner, he tilted his head toward a cafe I liked, the one with the chalkboard that changed, somehow on schedule and still looked like whim. I shook my head. He didn't insist. He asked if I would accept a ride. I said I would accept a walk. We went 3 blocks. I turned toward my street. He didn't follow an extra step, which told me he understood respect not as performance but as habit. He asked if I had everything I needed. I said I didn't know yet, but I had what I needed for tonight. He seemed to understand that this meant yes. For a week, we kept the quiet that work asked of us. The office was noisier than usual and then quieter, as if it had sighed out a problem and wasn't sure it should inhale again. I took meetings I'd once been asked to take. Now I was required to lead them. A board member who had never learned my name sent an email with my name spelled correctly and a sentence that recognized competence without tipping into awe. I deleted it after smiling. At night, I went home and let my apartment be a place where shoes could be left precisely or carelessly. I considered buying a houseplant and then remembered I did not enjoy orchestrating a fern's feelings. Daniel and I wrote to each other in the small hours. Not love notes, not even flirtations in the way we tend to define them. We sent the kind of messages that assume context and arrive without preamble. A photograph of a morning run under a pale sun with a caption that read, "Simply better." A picture of a page from a book about work and dignity and the difference between them. A line about a song on the radio and how memory can make even a bad song feel like an anthem. He asked me one night what sound I missed most. I told him it was the click of a door opening just when you decided it would remain closed. He sent back, before I finished regretting the intimacy, the sound of his kettle boiling and a note that said, "This then." We were careful. Everyone was watching Leo after the leak. By extension, everyone was watching me because I had been adjacent to the solution. We left parties at different times. We stood on opposite sides of rooms and looked like people who merely respected each other because we did respect each other, and because restraint is a language older than we admit. When we were the last two at a table after a long meeting, we did not reach for hands under the wood. We let our knees sit near and pretended that was nothing. It was not nothing. It was the second Friday after the storm when the second crisis arrived, smaller but meaner than the first. An industry blog, that hungry beast that knows gossip is the only currency some people truly honor, published a line that implied impropriety. It was coy and therefore effective. It mentioned a special relationship between a consultant and a member of the project team. It named no names. It didn't have to. The comments suggested that the leak had been discovered oddly fast. I recognized the tone. I had heard it after my divorce from people who loved a mystery they could decorate. HR called a meeting because process demands meetings. The board wanted a statement without admitting a situation existed. Leo wanted us all to remember that the world was not out to get us. Sometimes it was merely out to sell ads. Daniel and I sat at opposite ends of a glass table and learned how long a rumor can stretch without snapping. In the hallway, someone's whispered laughter sounded like a glass breaking very far away. That night, the building emptied again. The sky threatened rain and then withheld it. I stayed, not because there was overtime, but because work felt like the only tool I could use to sand down the splinters of anger. At 9, I stood looking at the city and the version of myself reflected back in the glass. A woman who had made a life out of competence and now found herself judged for a tenderness she hadn't even allowed to fully bloom. I thought, I have given the world my polished surfaces for years. It still prefers the shine of scandal. I was angry for every woman who had been accused of having an advantage that is, at best, a tentative comfort, and at worst, a liability. He found me in the conference room. He knocked on the glass and then did not open the door until I nodded. He had 2 paper cups from the cafe he hadn't pressed me to enter. The coffee was decaf and good enough. He set one down as if placing it by a sleeping person's bed. He said quietly that we could step back if I wanted. He said he could leave the project. He said what mattered most was what I could stand to live with in the mornings, and that for him, mornings had become the place worth protecting. He did not say that he wanted me. He didn't have to. It was so present in the room that if it had a scent, we would have needed a window open. I told him that what I couldn't stand was being a rumor's author by omission. The lie wasn't that something was happening. The lie was that it was happening like that, sloppy, transactional, a shortcut through a locked door. I told him the truth was this. We had chosen our steps carefully. We had kept our hands at our sides when we wanted them elsewhere. We had made the office the temple it demanded to be. And yet I wanted the sanctuary outside of it too, where dinner could be dinner without the soundtrack of watchfulness. He listened like a man who knew how to hear the part of a confession that is hope. He said that when his marriage ended, he learned that love is not erased by caution, it's erased by fear. He said that he had been erasing himself, little by little, to make room for a hypothetical future, and that my presence made the room feel accurate for the first time in a long time. We had been at a professional distance, 2 points on a line, separate but oriented. In that moment, the line folded. I reached for his hand not because I wanted to make a statement, but because I wanted to rest while standing. Our fingers fit in the way that made old clichés sound like field notes. Nothing else moved. The city went about its evening. We went to Leo the next morning. The office was quiet, the way it gets before a storm that exists only in calendars. We told him we intended to see each other. No flourish, no apology. I said I would step off the project if that made the ethics cleaner. Daniel said the same. Leo looked at the table, then at us, then at the window as if it could offer a precedent. He said that if we wanted to do this, we should do it clean. He said we should define boundaries, put them in writing, and make sure that every decision anyone might question would be deniable by proof, not by charm. He added softly that he liked happy endings, but he liked good beginnings more. We did the paperwork. HR offered forms the length of a novella. We moved Daniel's role to an advisory slot that couldn't touch my reporting line. I taken off 2 calls and added to others. We agreed to disclose any changes in status before anyone else had to find out. The rumor mill sputtered and then moved on to other feed. The blog wrote a half-hearted follow-up that sounded almost disappointed. And life, which had been on pause, resumed in small incremental scenes that made a kind of sense. We discovered that he cooked like a man who had lived alone too long, but cared anyway. A pan that knew the weight of onions, a drawer that held 3 perfect knives and little else. I discovered that my apartment, when a second pair of shoes sat by the door, did not feel like an invasion, but like a returned library book. He learned that I liked to put my phone face down, because I didn't want light to dictate attention. I learned that he liked to play records on Sunday mornings, low enough to speak over them without raising a voice. He ran the park loop. I walked it and watched the water. Sometimes we were silent together and felt, afterward, that we'd said a lot. We did not hide, exactly, but we let our small public gestures be ones the world already understood. A hand at my back as we stepped into a busy street, his jacket offered in a lobby with overzealous air conditioning, the casual way we said each other's names when someone asked for clarification, like every sentence was automatically plural now. The company steadied. The product launched on a Tuesday that pretended to be a Thursday. The investors smiled the way they do when numbers behave. The leak became a case study. The intern program changed its permissions. The jazz in the hallway moved to a different floor. The city did what cities do, provided a backdrop and pretended indifference while noticing everything. In late autumn, a conference took us to another skyline that thought very highly of itself. We were careful on flights, in hotels, in rooms full of colleagues from other companies who liked to make their curiosity the main event. One evening, after panels and questions about roadmaps that felt as personal as audits, the elevator to our floor shuddered between levels and stopped. The number glowed a steady, stubborn 7. A bell rang the way bells do when they have no power to fix anything. The car was well lit. The air was still. The 2 of us were in it alone. We looked at each other and then at the little door that hides the emergency phone as if maybe, finally, we would be given a cliché to inhabit and could give in to the scene. Instead, we laughed. The sound was quiet and unafraid. He reached for my hand and I let him have it. The elevator hummed the way elevators do when they too are tired. We waited. We breathed. We were briefly a rumor's favorite dream. We behaved as if we had nothing to prove to anyone, and the car started again as if it had granted us permission. Months later, when the weather warmed into that kindness that makes even concrete smell like possibility, I found myself at my desk at dusk with the windows open just enough to hear the street. The office had emptied early because an awards dinner promised rubber chicken and applause. I'd declined with a headache and relief. I watched the city discard daylight slowly, and I thought about the first rain and the night we'd been locked in. The memory had no edges left on it. It was not the beginning anymore. It was one of many moments that had decided to matter. He texted that he was downstairs, not with impatience but with the casual grace of someone already within your orbit. I took the elevator to the lobby and stepped into the kind of evening that sits on your skin like a hand. He stood by the glass, profile familiar now, and I felt the quiet luxury of recognition. He looked up and smiled, and the room brightened by exactly the same wattage it had the first time. Some things, thankfully, do not adjust. We walked out past the revolving doors and into the kind of city night that makes every storefront look like a stage set. He reached for my hand, not as an announcement, but because it made walking easier. We passed a couple arguing gently, a kid bouncing a ball with an optimism that seemed imported from a better world, a woman in a red coat who knew where she was going. The streetlights flickered in their usual choreography. Somewhere above us, a window closed. Somewhere on a balcony, a radio decided what song meant tonight. We went to dinner where the wine was cold and the pasta unapologetically itself. He told me a story about Leo from 20 years ago that made me like them both more. I told him a story about myself from 10 years ago that made me forgive myself for how long it took to become this version. We didn't talk about the leak or the rumor or the elevator that frozen for a minute and tried to make itself a metaphor. We talked about the trip we would take when winter decided to be kind, about his brother's good day last Tuesday, about the small victory of finding a record in a thrift store that sounds like it remembers your house. Hater, outside, the city breathed in that strange, unified way it sometimes does when thousands of strangers, in the space of a single block, agree to be gentle. The office rose behind us, a tower of glass and light, an aquarium for commerce. I looked up and tried to find the room where we had sat with a borrowed blanket and an honest quiet. He followed my gaze. He put his palm lightly at the small of my back in that way he does when he means to say, without words, I'm here. The gesture was nothing. It was everything. We walked. We didn't hurry. The night didn't either. The old life, the woman who stayed late because the familiar shape of a monitor's glow felt safer than the uncertain outline of a hand, was still there, somewhere, kind and unnecessary. The new life wasn't flashes of lightning or declarations in rooms with microphones. It was this: the choice, again and again, to show up where the other person was, not across a desk or behind a policy, but within reach. Weeks turned to months. Storms came and were endured. Meetings were held and ended. Birthdays arrived. We invented rituals. A Sunday walk without headphones, a Thursday text of the least significant detail of the day. Elevators smelled like oranges. A rule about never leaving a room angry, even if leaving the room was necessary. We allowed each other to be very good at work and very imperfect at home. He learned that I sleep with the window open as soon as the weather allows, even if it's 1 degree too early. I learned that he organized spices by cuisine and broke his own rule every time he cooked. When the company's lights dimmed one by one each evening, their rectangles of brightness sliding off the walls until the glass held only the city's reflection, I often stayed just long enough to see that last square go dark. Not because I needed to finish something, but because I liked the punctuation. I'd walk to the elevator, and as the doors closed, I would catch a sliver of the office's mirror and see, not a ghost, but a woman with a coat over her arm and a place to be. Sometimes he was waiting at the curb. Sometimes I met him 2 blocks away. Always his shadow lingered near mine. I never did buy the plant. I did buy a second toothbrush and forgot to tell him, which meant he discovered it on a morning when our schedules were gracelessly misaligned. He lifted it with surprise and a smile that did not panic, and we both understood that a choice had been made in the quiet. Love, or what we let ourselves call love when we stopped trying to make it look good for strangers, had slipped in the way good habits do. Through repetition, through kindness, through the honesty of small things done without the theater of a grand scene. Sometimes on evenings when the wind made the traffic lights sway and the cafe chalkboard announced a soup that sounded like an apology, we would sit on our couch and read separate books with our feet touching. He would reach for my hand without looking, and I, who had made certainty out of solitude, would let him. The storm would tap at the window and then grow bored. The record would crackle. The city would hum. And I would think, with a clarity that felt like grace. None of this is a rumor. It is simply the truth we chose.